Reasons people might vote for Kamala Harris. Historical significance. As a woman of color, African American and South Asian heritage, many voters may see her election as a milestone in breaking barriers of race and gender in U.S. leadership experience in government. Harris served as California's Attorney General and as a U.S. Senator, giving her a significant background in law enforcement and legislative work, progressive policies. Supporters of progressive ideals appreciate her positions on climate change, social justice reform, and healthcare. Healthcare. She supports expanding healthcare access through policies like Medicare for All, which appeals to those who prioritize healthcare reform. Criminal justice reform. Despite criticisms, she has taken a firm stance on modernizing criminal justice, focusing on reducing mass incarceration and reforming law enforcement policies. Climate change advocacy. Harris has consistently voiced her support for bold action on climate change, which appeals to voters concerned about environmental sustainability. Pro-choice stance. Harris is strongly pro-choice, supporting reproductive rights, which resonates with voters who prioritize women's healthcare issues. Support for working families. She advocates for policies like paid family leave and affordable childcare, aimed at helping working-class families. Gun control. Harris has pushed for stricter gun control, including universal background checks and banning assault weapons, which appeals to voters concerned about gun violence, diversity, and inclusion. Her background and advocacy for LGBTQ+ rights and racial justice resonate with voters who value diversity and equality. COVID-19 response. Harris played a role in advocating for robust pandemic response plans and economic recovery efforts during the Biden administration, which appeals to those who appreciate a cautious approach to public health. Foreign policy. She supports a diplomatic approach to foreign policy, with a focus on multilateralism and alliances, which appeals to voters seeking a more collaborative U.S. presence globally. Support for labor rights. Harris has expressed strong support for unions and workers' rights, which appeals to voters who want to see protections for labor. Taxation policies. Her focus on making the wealthy pay their fair share of taxes appeals to voters interested in reducing income inequality. Support for education. Harris has backed policies to make college more affordable and support public education, which is crucial to many voters. Infrastructure investment. She supports investments in infrastructure, particularly focusing on green energy and technology. Women's rights. Harris has been a champion of women's equality, pay equity, and fighting gender-based violence, which appeals to many female voters. Immigration reform. She supports comprehensive immigration reform, including a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, appealing to voters who support a humane immigration policy. Vice presidential experience. As vice president under Joe Biden, she has gained executive experience, positioning her as prepared to take on the presidency. Kamala Harris has not yet served as president, so her direct economic impact is limited to her role as vice president under the Biden administration and her previous work as a senator and attorney general of California. However, I can describe her influence on economic policies, as well as her potential economic priorities and stance on key issues. Here's an overview of Kamala Harris's economic impact based on her current role and past positions. 1. Support for Biden's economic agenda. As vice president, Harris has played a supportive role in promoting and advocating for the Biden administration's economic policies, although the primary leadership on these policies comes from President Biden himself. These initiatives include American Rescue Plan. Harris supported the American Rescue Plan, a $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief package aimed at stimulating the economy through direct payments to Americans, expanded unemployment benefits, and aid for small businesses. Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Harris has advocated for the $1.2 trillion infrastructure package, which focuses on rebuilding roads, bridges, and public transportation systems while also investing in clean energy. This plan is seen as a long-term boost to jobs and economic competitiveness. 2. COVID-19 recovery. Harris has been instrumental in advocating for policies aimed at economic recovery post-COVID-19, including vaccine rollout and economic recovery. As vice president, Harris promoted the mass vaccination efforts, which were critical in reopening the economy, allowing businesses to return to normal operations, and reducing unemployment. Child tax credit expansion. Harris has backed expanding the child tax credit, which provided additional financial support to low and middle-income families, reducing child poverty rates and giving households more disposable income to fuel economic growth. 3. Focus on racial and gender economic equality. Throughout her career, Harris has emphasized the need for policies that address economic disparities based on race and gender, equity-focused programs. As Vice President, she has been a vocal advocate for ensuring that the economic recovery is inclusive and that it benefits historically marginalized communities. She supports policies aimed at reducing the racial wealth gap and improving access to housing, education, and capital for minorities and women. Support for working women. Harris has been a strong advocate for policies like paid family leave, affordable childcare, and pay equity legislation, arguing that these measures will increase women's participation in the workforce and boost overall economic growth. 4. Small business support and entrepreneurship. Harris has consistently voiced support for small businesses and entrepreneurship, particularly for minority and women-owned businesses. Paycheck Protection Program, PPP. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Harris worked to ensure that the PPP loans reached underserved businesses. She supported reforms to the program to ensure minority-owned businesses had fair access to capital for underserved entrepreneurs. Harris has pushed for policies that increase access to capital for small businesses, especially in communities of color, through initiatives like the Community Advantage Loan Program. 5. Environmental and green economy. One of Harris's significant economic priorities is the transition to a clean energy economy, green energy jobs. Harris supports investments in renewable energy, such as wind and solar, which she believes will create millions of new, high-paying jobs. She sees the transition to a low-carbon economy as both an environmental necessity and an economic opportunity. Environmental justice. Harris has focused on environmental justice for low-income and minority communities that are disproportionately affected by pollution and climate change. By promoting clean energy in these areas, she advocates for improved health outcomes and economic opportunities. 6. Healthcare as an economic issue. Harris views access to affordable healthcare as a key economic issue, believing that healthcare costs are a burden on families and businesses. Medicare for all. During her 2020 presidential campaign, Harris expressed support for a version of Medicare for all, which she believes would reduce healthcare costs for American families. Although she has since supported Biden's more moderate approach to expanding the Affordable Care Act, lowering prescription drug costs, Harris has supported policies to lower the cost of prescription drugs, seeing it as a way to provide financial relief to families and boost their disposable income. 7. Labor rights and wage growth. Harris has consistently supported stronger labor protections and higher wages for workers. $15 minimum wage. She supports increasing the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour, believing it will reduce poverty and boost consumer spending, thereby stimulating the economy. Union support. Harris is a strong advocate for labor unions and has pushed for legislation that strengthens workers' rights to organize. She believes that empowering unions will help raise wages and improve working conditions for low and middle-income workers. 8. Housing and homelessness. Harris has been an advocate for affordable housing and tackling homelessness, particularly during her time as senator from California. Affordable housing investments. Harris has supported federal investments in affordable housing to address housing shortages, which she believes are a major driver of inequality. She has also proposed renter tax credits to help low-income families cope with rising housing costs. Homelessness initiatives. In California, where the housing crisis and homelessness are particularly acute, Harris has pushed for solutions to alleviate the crisis, seeing stable housing as key to economic security. 9. Support for the gig economy and workers' rights. As a former Attorney General of California, Harris has experience addressing labor issues, including the rights of gig workers, AB 5 and gig worker rights. Harris has supported California's AB 5 law, which classifies many gig workers, like Uber and Lyft drivers, as employees rather than independent contractors. This means they are entitled to benefits like minimum wage, healthcare, and unemployment insurance. Harris's support for these kinds of policies indicates her focus on workers' rights and fair wages in the new economy. 10. Education and workforce development. Harris sees education as a critical component of economic growth and has been an advocate for expanding access to affordable education. Free community college. Harris supports free community college as a way to provide accessible education and job training to more Americans, particularly in growing sectors like tech and healthcare. Student loan debt relief. Harris supports policies that aim to reduce the burden of student loan debt, which she argues hampers economic mobility for millions of young adults. Summary of Kamala Harris's economic impact and priorities. Support for Biden's economic agenda. Harris plays a key role in advancing Biden's agenda, focusing on recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, infrastructure, and social safety nets. Focus on equity. A strong advocate for racial and gender economic equality, Harris pushes for policies that reduce disparities in wealth, healthcare, and education, environmental and green economy. Harris promotes green energy investments, believing they will create new jobs and combat climate change, labor and wages. She advocates for a $15 minimum wage and stronger worker protections, particularly for gig workers and union members. Small business and entrepreneurship. Harris supports policies that increase access to capital for minority and women-owned businesses, particularly in underserved communities. While her direct economic influence has primarily been as vice president and legislator, Kamala Harris is seen as someone who supports progressive policies that aim to address inequality and promote sustainable economic growth, with a focus on marginalized communities. Yours psychophilosopher.